I'm Katie at the Elder Justice Center. We're just trying to get everybody on.
Hello, can anyone hear me?
Hi. This is Katie from the Minnesota Elder Justice Center. Sean and Amanda should be on in a minute.
Katie, can you see me? I'm here.
I cannot see you. Oh, I see you now, Amanda. Yep. Lori, your camera is off.
My camera is off?
Yeah, here, I can manually override it. Hold on. I think. Yeah, Lori, can you click, if you hold your arrow down at the bottom where the toolbar comes up, can you just hit start video?
It was started, so I'm confused. I just took it off.
Oh, you're on here twice.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I'll take me off once.
Yeah, that's what it is. I was looking at your name here and hearing your voice over here. Okay, that's it. Yep.
Katie, do the headphones work fine, or would you rather have me just have the laptop?
Oh, it sounds the same. I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Hold
I
on.
was having issues switching around. And I'm going to rename myself again.
Sean is asking me to resend a link to one panelist, so that's what I'm trying to do right now.
Katie, how many ended up registering? 400 and what?
I think it was 430 something this morning. A second. I got
three. You said three, right? 3 people only. No worries, panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it was like 19.
483?
No, 430 something. Hold on one second. I gotta get.
Sorry, Mary. Can you believe that we actually had a conversation internally about whether or not we should try and host this more as a conversation? And we were worried. We might get a couple hundred people to show up, and we wouldn't be able to handle that. So I think this was a good call that we are not trying to. How do you keep the center partners conversation?
Yeah. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah. So. It's like you do the best that you can with the networking and the conversation, but you can't really do that with 440 people.
Nope.
In a way that
it'd be interesting as heck, but nope.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We have 282. We have 480 registered now.
Don't people have anything to do today? I mean, seriously, come on. It's only World Elder Abuse Awareness Day.
People should just stop telling us the numbers because I'll get tongue twisted. And
no, you should just think of it as they're really they want information on this topic, right? So.
Well, and I'm like, I don't want to see the attendees because how many of them do I know?
I didn't look at them. Nope, I don't.
Yeah, you won't be able to see them. They'll just be able to see you guys as panelists.
You're just talking to us. We're just talking to us.
And so my region, that's going to give me a hard time the next time we have a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so you guys
know you'll be a celebrity.
Hold on, I just need to give a little bit of information quick.
Okay.
So Sean's not on yet, so I'll do it. So what we're gonna do is if people have questions, they're gonna put those in the chat box, and then I'll monitor them and then just send them directly to the panelists. So and Sean will moderate to ask you. But so if there's 500 questions and they're half the same, we can just kind of filter them out. So don't worry about monitoring the chat box. We'll do that.
So when you say send them to us, Katie, you mean like you'll just tell us when there's a question that we should answer, or you can email
So
it?
on the chat box, there's an option that you can select send to all, like everyone attending, or
Oh,
you can send just to panelists. And so I will be going through the big box and I will add them to the just the two panelists, and then Sean will read them specifically to you. So if it's a question for you, Mary, he'll say, Mary, blah, blah, blah. But it's just, I'm just letting you know that if you're talking and you see the chat box and it's going like this, you don't have to read those all. Like we'll filter them out.
I'm just going to close it.
Do it.
And Katie, are the attendees, can they hear right now, or are the attendees totally, it's just the panelists that are on this right now and can hear
They
and
can
see?
hear us. There's
Okay.
6 people on right now, but they're probably muted. So
See, mine says 12.
that's counting you guys and me.
Oh, we're counted double.
Yeah, I can see the difference of the panelists and attendees. Now there's 9
I
attendees.
see.
Yeah.
I see you.
Oh, here's Sean. Sean, I just explained the Q&A, how that I'll monitor the chat box and then send them to you, and you'll moderate the questions to who the appropriate panelist is.
Perfect.
And I resent that one to Sherry, so the link.
Did everyone get a chance to meet Amanda, our executive director, if you haven't already?
We've been chatting, but I didn't
Okay.
actually introduce myself.
Great.
Cool.
And we're waiting for Marit too, right?
Mhm.
Mara and the one I just resent.
There she is. Oh, and Sherry.
Jerry, yeah. I resent it when I resent yours at the same time. So.
Okay.
And I'll take my camera off once it starts, so don't.
And I can take my camera off once, so then there's,
Well,
or do
what
you
I'm
want
going
me
to
to
try to
stay?
do is black whoever, like if Mary's talking, I'm going to black the rest of you out, or if Mara's talking, that's what I'm going to try to do
Yeah,
on
I just-
my end.
I want people to be able to see and focus on
Yeah,
the
exactly.
great information and not, yeah.
And so that you don't have to sit there like,
So are you going to do that, Katie, or do we?
yeah,
Like, I would.
I have the, yep, I can do that from my end. I'm logged in as the Elder Justice Center
Okay.
account, so I can, like, there's a camera by each of you and a mute. So you have control to do it yourself though too, but if you don't worry, if you don't turn yourself on or off, I can do it right here.
I'll probably turn myself off when I'm done.
Yep.
But if I forget, turn me off.
Yep.
And then were we able to quick practice the share screen? Mary, do you want to try yours and I'll
Sure.
do mine?
Yep.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Perfect.
Mhm. Yep.
All
You
right.
know, stop sharing.
I'll try mine. And I'll put it into slideshow mode. You can see it?
Mhm.
Okay.
One thing that happens though on my end, when you share the screen, I lose this panel to turn you off. So like right now when everyone's on here, I can turn everyone's camera on or off.
Let me try it
Oh.
again to give you a chance
Yeah.
to find it. Hold on.
Okay, I got it. I figured I'll do it. Yeah, I just have to make you full screen and then I can get that back. Okay.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, maybe we can keep the we can mute all of us picture-wise, Katie, and I'll put up the lead screen.
Just one quick 5 minutes of self-introduction. You want us to go about how we respond to self-neglect.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Katie, you were on mute if you were trying to say something.
You're speaking first, right, Sean?
Yes, I will start us right off. Just a brief welcome and intro, and I'll pass it right over to Amanda.
Okay. And then Mary?
Amanda will pass it to Mara, and Mara will pass it to Mary.
Okay.
And then I'll jump back in after Mary's.
Got it. Okay, Sean, I've blacked out all of the screens but yours. But I see your whole slide set is what's showing. So.
Okay, great. Well, I'll do a announcement at like 5 till, and then we'll get started right at 1 o'clock.
Sounds good.
Hello to those of you joining us. We will be starting in 5 minutes, right at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for your interest in World Elder Abuse Awareness Day and specifically our topic on self-neglect today. I will go over this again when we start the webinar, but if you have never been to a Zoom meeting yet, you have some options in terms of participating. You are we can't see you or hear you, and that's on that's on purpose, but you can communicate to us via the Q&A box. So if you toggle around your screen, you should see a question and answer that you can go ahead and direct to either the panelists or to everyone. And as I'll explain in a little bit, we'll be answering, taking questions throughout, and we'll have a dedicated question and answer time later in our presentation. So we will get started here in the next couple of minutes as our attendees continue to file in. Thank you. All right, well, welcome everyone. It is the top of the hour. We have folks, I think, joining us from across the country, although most participants are in Minnesota. My name is Sean Burke. I'm the Public Policy Director at the Minnesota Elder Justice Center, and today is our World Elder Abuse Awareness Day Center Partners Forum. Before I turn it over to our Executive Director, Amanda Vikstrom, to talk a little bit more about why we're gathering today and to give a little bit of a preview of our event today, I did just want to talk a couple of logistics. So if you've never done a Zoom meeting yet, you have a few options on how to participate. You will not. You're muted both audio and video throughout, and that is by design, so we don't have 300 face boxes showing up, but you will be able to see the panelists as we talk throughout the presentation today and have our conversations, and then you'll also be able to see our screens as we share them. You can participate by asking questions either in the Q&A box. There should be an option for that on your screen, or also in the chat box. Either one of those will work, and at the appropriate time we will answer questions. Feel free to send them in throughout though. There is a CEU credit available, and CLE credit has been applied for as well, and then copies of the materials that we'll share today. All information about how to access all of that will be sent in a follow-up email after today's presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Amanda Vikstrom, who will talk a little bit more about World Elder Abuse Awareness Day and our organization.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Sean. My name is Amanda Vikstrom. I'm the Executive Director at the Minnesota Elder Justice Center. For those of you that are joining us for the first time today, welcome. Happy to have you. And for those of you that are regular participants and collaborators of ours, we are just excited to have you continue on this conversation in these new ways. So the Minnesota Elder Justice Center, for those of you that don't know us, we are a nonprofit based in the Twin Cities serving the state of Minnesota. We provide direct services to victims and their families who are either experiencing or suspect that they're experiencing abuse, neglect, financial exploitation, and maltreatment. So we have advocates that provide confidential advocacy and systems navigation services for those experiencing abuse. We have professional training, so we are happy to train your individual group or profession, and we also have begun since COVID-19 looking at how we train in new ways and are offering weekly free webinars on various aspects of abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. We are also excited when we have the opportunity to talk in front of community members, and so happy to do community outreach and outreach presentations with libraries and churches and community centers. In pre-COVID, like all of us, we were happy to drive wherever you were located and do that training and outreach throughout the state. Now we are working virtually like all of you, and will be for some time still. So the outreach and our networking and our connections, we don't want to lose those. And so reach out to us, and we're happy to just do that in new ways until we can meet face to face again. And we also have Sean, you may already know that Sean leads our public policy efforts. And so we do also work with many of you and look at systems changes that are necessary. So when we know that an individual or individuals might be continuing to experience a problem, we look at what other changes might be necessary at the legislature or within the systems in our state. And so then we will work with others, like you all know, to address those issues. So we are excited to have you all here today. And I mean, this was meant to be, this Center Partners topic discussing self-neglect was really meant to be at our first Center Partners meeting. So for those of you that never participated in our Center Partners meetings, we met once a month, the second Friday of the month at William Mitchell, to talk with our peers in working with vulnerable and older adults across the state to talk about professional education, opportunities for ourselves, networking, and really emerging trends and issues that we were seeing in the policy world, and talking about change. And so that center partners really, that existed for years before the Minnesota Elder Justice Center in the form of the Vulnerable Adult Justice Project. And so the life of that forum was, existed for 10, 12 years. And we didn't want that to go away, but we wanted to talk about how do we recreate the center partners in a new way. And so we had hoped to launch this very first new Partners Forum in mid-March. And we're going to be talking about the topic that we have today, self-neglect. And ideally, we're going to be doing that in person at LSS, but with more online technology available so that our partners who are living and working in greater Minnesota would also be able to participate. Really wanted to expand our reach and not just have it be the 35 people that would show up once a month, and really be able to dig deeper on topics and have more people engaged. So like many of you, when COVID hit in March, we had to postpone that. And so this is really that conversation that we wanted to have in March, we're having today. And we're doing it on what I think many of you know as World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. Typically, we're meeting in person this week at our annual conference. So World Elder Abuse Awareness Day has been around since 2006, and we here in Minnesota have had a conference, an in-person conference for many of those years. And for us, that opportunity to come together, that networking, the learning in a common space is really critical. But we knew that we couldn't have the conference that we wanted this year in person at Earl Brown. And so we initially postponed the conference to August 24th and 25th. And you'll be getting more information soon, but we are moving that to a virtual platform because we don't feel it's responsible to meet in person in the numbers that we hope to have out on August 24th and 25th. So you will be getting more information about registration and what that conference looks like virtually. And we are really excited to, we're building a really great curriculum and opportunity for us to learn and gather more. So we'll just be continuing the learning. And so we'll have more information about that out soon. It's really important for us to be able to have this event of some sort today on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day so that we can continue the conversation. We did decide to take this opportunity to talk about self-neglect. It's a critical elder justice issue, and it's one that we don't always think of intrinsically with elder abuse. And there's a lot of connotations even around when we say self-neglect and are looking at a victim and a perpetrator. That language is really divisive, and I'm really excited to have Mart Peterson will be setting the stage, and Mary McGurran around what is self-neglect and what are we talking about. What we know is that individuals who are experiencing self-neglect and professionals who are working with individuals who are experiencing this struggle. It is a critical issue, and it really speaks to a lack of available services and how do we help individuals get the services that they need to be able to live the lives that they want and do it safely. So I'm really excited to be able to dig in today on this subject. We have today with us several speakers that will be able to have this conversation. Mart Peterson will talk a little bit more about self-neglect on this day in particular and why it's important. Mart is the director of our training and strategic relationships programs. Mart's been with us since 2015, and so she'll be able to really provide that overview for all of you. And then Mary McGurran, who is with our state adult protection services program at the Department of Human Services, will provide an update and an overview on where self-neglect is in Minnesota right now. And then we're really excited to have a panel of people who are working with this issue every day in counties and areas throughout the state. So Corinne Graham from Clay County Adult Protection, Lori Halber from Catholic Charities, and Sherry Beznicek from the Ramsey County Adult Protection will be able to talk with Mary and with Sean Burke about what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis and how we can strategize to better serve older adults who are experiencing self-neglect. And we'll be able to provide, take some audience questions. So as Sean said, you can use the chat feature and submit questions, and we'll be able to pass some of those along to the panelists and providing a wrap up. So I'm thrilled that we have so many of you in attendance today. I think we had around 480 people register for this, which is what we would, a number that we would be happy with attending our in-person World Elder Abuse Awareness Day conference. So I'm thrilled that we have so many people joining us for this webinar and this conversation today, and hope that you'll be able to really take a lot of useful information and tools out of it. I will now turn it over to, have Katie turn us over to Marit Peterson to talk a little bit about why we're talking about self-neglect today on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. Hi, Marit.
Hi. Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Marit Peterson, as Amanda said, and like Amanda, I am thrilled to be here with you today discussing this issue. Really grateful to those of us who took time out of their days to join us. It's just a tremendous opportunity to have this critical conversation. So I'm thankful for that, and want to welcome everybody as well. I'm just providing a little bit of context for this discussion of self-neglect. These are issues that we've talked about and intersections that we've discussed at the Minnesota Elder Justice Center, and then other issues and intersections that have been brought to our attention by our community partners who are participating both as panelists and as participants or audience members today. So thank you for that ongoing conversation about self-neglect. You know, as with many issues that sit at the intersection of health, law, rights, quality of life, even our vocabulary, as Amanda alluded to, can feel confusing, can feel inadequate. The term self-neglect is itself challenging as we think about situations in which individuals are putting themselves at risk or putting themselves in danger. One broader challenge that I want to address has to do with our collective ownership of this issue. I think as our conversation has turned critically towards issues of racial injustice, we see underlying disparities affecting communities of color, resulting in greater risks for and greater risks for severe harm from abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation, as well as self-neglect. We've begun to broadly discuss systems of prevention and, crucially, of early intervention in our communities. So a question arises regarding whether it's possible that Minnesota communities themselves could become models for meaningful services and supports at the prevention stage. And I think our adult protection and direct service colleagues here on the panel, and as well as those of you who are joining us in our audience, have a great deal to teach us about that opportunity. So I'm welcoming that as well. However, if we see self-neglect as a problem for APS to solve, we have failed. And Kathy Greenlee, who is a thought leader in this space, really observed this in her address to the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day conference last year, which is that we must attend collectively to the needs of individuals for supports that are among our most basic rights. So we'll speak to that as well today. I think that orientation will help us center the needs of individuals. And as we move towards a less paternalistic approach that really balances the dignity of risk against the need for safety, it will understand our views of what is acceptable, what is appropriate, or even what is safe, recognizing that those views themselves are rooted in a cultural perspective that suffers from the same racism, sexism, ableism, and ageism that plague all of our systems. So we'll think through that and talk through that to some extent today as well. And then finally, I just want to observe that self-neglect is a significant risk factor for other forms of harm, including abuse, other types of neglect, and exploitation. So if we are able to thoughtfully support a true interdependence, which is really individuals supported in communities, we will be assisted in reducing risks for other forms of maltreatment as well. So that's meaningful for us at MEJC as well. Our state is in the middle of a reexamination of our own laws related to the investigation and treatment of abuse, neglect, financial exploitation, and self-neglect as a part of a larger reevaluation of our Minnesota Vulnerable Adult Act. And so this makes it an excellent time to hear from our panel today about self-neglect. We hope that today's conversation really can be a catalyst for further discussion, for changes potentially in the way that we approach self-neglect cases. So I now have the tremendous pleasure of introducing Mary McGurran, who is the Adult Protection Supervisor for the State of Minnesota Department of Human Services. And I just want to take a moment to thank Mary tremendously for sharing her expertise with us both today and on the many occasions in which she is called on by us to share her expertise. So thank you, Mary, and welcome, Mary and everybody.
Thank you very much, all of you from the Minnesota Elder Justice Center for hosting this forum today on such an important day as World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, and giving us an opportunity to look at this issue of neglect when someone neglects their own needs in the context of all the other kinds of maltreatment that occur. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the panel. What I'm gonna do is share my screen, so just give me a second here. And it's not wanting to cover up all the other things. Here we go. Super. Okay. So the way that I'd like to start is just talking about a little bit what we do at the Department of Human Services. We have a unit for adult protection. We don't provide adult protective services. What we do is support statewide identification and response for suspected abuse, neglect, financial exploitation, and self-neglect of an adult who someone believes to be vulnerable. And we do that through public awareness and through operation of the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center, or the MARC. And this fabulous team here, who you see on your screen, are all the folks that are behind this work that I'm talking about right now. We also provide support for adult protective services programs, and I'll talk a little bit about how adult protection is delivered in Minnesota. Support those adult protective service programs delivered by counties and tribes by offering policy guidance, training, consultation, case resources, and data for their program management. We also maintain data to track critical steps in response to vulnerable adult maltreatment, and the data is also used for resource allocation for adult protection. And we serve as a resource for evaluation, prevention, and service response for vulnerable adult maltreatment. So thanks here to this great team from the department who is helping the great adult protection service programs and workers and managers and supervisors on the ground who are delivering adult protective services, as well as all the folks that are providing support for vulnerable adults and older adults in our state. And you'll kind of see how some of that plays out when we look at the data that we're going to talk about today. So what to know about self-neglect in Minnesota? I just want to provide a little framework for what I'm going to discuss. And that would be how we look at adult protection and ethics, some of the definitions that we use in adult protection, and what self-neglect is considered legally in Minnesota, and how we're changing our response and understanding of self-neglect. And that leads right into the Vulnerable Adult Act redesign, which Mara was talking about, which is really a chance for our state to take a look at issues of equity and justice and sensitivity, in order to ensure that all Minnesotans have the dignity and justice that they deserve. There are a lot of professionals that provide support to older and vulnerable adults around this topic. And when we think about that, we're talking about doctors and nurses and PCAs and counselors and social workers and hospitals and home care and long-term care, case managers, care coordinators, outreach, community service workers and organizations like VOA and LSS and Catholic Charities and MEJC, faith communities, and family, friends, and neighbors. Everyone is connecting with people who are vulnerable in our community, all those people who connect with those who are vulnerable in our community, to engage and connect with vulnerable adults and older adults to address that person's needs. And this engagement and service response by all these different people in our community and professionals in our community really helps prevent the neglect that we're going to talk about, so that those vulnerable adults never are reported to the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center and don't need to get to the point where Adult Protective Services is deciding how they should respond to that report. So there's so much going on, and you'll hear about some of it in the panel, but there's so many other professionals and partners that are working in this area to respond to these issues and to really support people in our communities. Self-neglect in our state has a very specific definition, and so we'll talk about that, as does in our state who is vulnerable or who is considered a vulnerable adult. So just going to briefly touch on those as well, and understand that those reports that are coming into the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center are going to different agencies in addition to adult protection, depending on what the issue is. So some of those reports go to the Department of Human Services, Office of Inspector General in the licensing area. Some of those reports go to the Health Department, and some of those reports then go to County Adult Protective Services. So the comments and the data that we're going to look at today is really only pertinent to Adult Protective Services, because Adult Protective Services is the only agency that responds to MARC reports with a social service response. The other agencies are looking at licensing and other issues related to who may be responsible for that maltreatment. Adult Protection is the only agency that's addressing the self-neglect of the person, of the individual. And when I talk about Adult Protective Services, I'm talking about those programs or those services that are delivered by counties and some tribes as a social service program through their social service structure, and it's outlined under the statute. APS duties are outlined under the statute. APS only has authority in Minnesota to respond to self-neglect of a vulnerable adult that's reported to MARC. So all of their work is coming through that funnel of the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center. So in Minnesota, when we talk about self-neglect in the real formal legal way, I mean, we can all talk about someone who's not meeting their needs or not neglecting their necessary needs. When we talk about self-neglect of a vulnerable adult, it's a very specific person that fits a very specific category that we're talking about. And in Minnesota, although this is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, Minnesota doesn't use an age criteria for who's a vulnerable adult. So it's 18 or over, and there's not a certain point where someone becomes a vulnerable adult simply based on their age in Minnesota. Minnesota is a person-centered state, and we look at people's individual abilities. And so that's what we call being categorically vulnerable in Minnesota, is anyone who's in a hospital or a nursing home, assisted living, customized living, adult foster care, receiving a program that's licensed by the Department of Human Services, the Department of Health, is a categorical vulnerable adult. That's kind of like our non-person-centered definition. Anyone who's in that program or in that service or in that facility is categorically vulnerable. And then we have the functional vulnerability, which is really our person-centered response to adult protection, who's eligible for Adult Protective Services. And that's people who, because they have an impairment in their ability, and that impairment impacts their ability to meet a necessary need, and they also have an impaired ability to protect themselves from maltreatment. So they have an impairment, a need that they are dependent on someone else to assist them with, and they're unable to, or have an impaired ability to protect themselves from maltreatment. So that's a pretty thin slice of people. And again, that's our looking at individuals specifically for who's vulnerable in our state. And the things that adult protection responds to in our state are abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and neglect. And neglect is a mission of care or services that could result in lack of food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, or supervision that's reasonable and necessary to maintain the adult who is vulnerable's mental, emotional, or physical health or safety. So neglect is not having something that you need. Then when we talk about self-neglect, which is the topic of today's discussion, self-neglect is an act or omission by the adult who is vulnerable, who meets that previous definition that we talked about, either categorically or based on their own impaired ability to protect themselves from maltreatment, that results or could result in the lack of food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, supervision. So we're really talking about your basic social service, human service needs, and medical care that are reasonable and necessary to maintain their physical, mental, emotional health, comfort, or safety when there's no caregiver with the responsibility for those care services. So self-neglect is when those necessary needs to maintain life and health and safety and comfort are not being provided, and there's no one whose responsibility it is to do that. The reason that we have a very specific definition is to respect that people have rights to make choices and have their own values and personalities and choose how they live. People have the right to refuse treatment. That's built into our statute as well. This little snippet of a definition that you're seeing here is really a multi-page, multi-paragraph definition that's been brought down here. And in the overall definition, it respects people's rights to refuse treatment, to have choice. And we all have to recognize that every time someone doesn't take a medication, every time they don't make an appointment or don't do preventative care or don't do follow-up care for a diagnosis, or they don't follow a healthy diet, or their house isn't maintained well or cleaned well, their personal hygiene isn't great, doesn't meet the definition of self-neglect. Because self-neglect, when it's reportable under our statute and goes into the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center, is really initiating a government response. And as the United States of America that operates under a constitution that has a lot to do with freedom and individual rights, we have to have that careful limit for when the government, in this case, is going to get involved. All those other folks we talked about previously can get involved without that kind of a criteria, but adult protection has a very, very specific floor, essentially, for their involvement. So the kinds of things when we talk about self-neglect that we're thinking about are when are these kinds of signs. And you're looking at things like unpaid bills, people that don't have heat, water, electricity, or insurance. And it's not an economic issue, it's an issue of their inability to protect themselves and manage their own affairs in a way that ensures that they have those basic, comfortable and safe living situation. People that are having driving and getting into accidents because they have an impairment. People that are leaving on the stove, leading to fires, again, due to impairment or confusion. People that are wandering, not people that are leaving because they don't want to be someplace, but people that are wandering, confused. People that have wounds, need medical care that they're not receiving. People that are have carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide in their home and they don't recognize it because of an impairment. People that are missing life-sustaining medical treatment, not because they're choosing to do that, but because they can't remember that they have those kinds of appointments. People that are living in homes with excessive garbage, spoiled food, human or animal waste, or people that don't have adequate housing because they cannot understand their situation and their needs and protect themselves from that neglect. There's been research on who we're talking about when we are looking at who is self-neglecting, to use the term that we're talking about without a caregiver, and it's people that have impairments, cognitive impairments, traumatic brain injury, dementia, other kinds of impairments in their thinking, people that have disabilities combined with those impairments, people that have mental health or depressive symptoms, and people that have low social engagement. And we know that for all sorts of maltreatment, that having low social engagement is a risk factor. So if you look at what happens in Minnesota, so these are reports that were reported to the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center of all the kinds of maltreatment that are identified in Minnesota when those reports were under the APS or the county jurisdiction for response. So these aren't things that went to the health department or went to the Office of Inspector General at DHS to respond to. These are things that counties responded to. And what's the highest? Yep, self-neglect. So self-neglect is the most common allegation that's reported to the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center, and the most common allegation that counties and tribes are responding to in their adult protective services systems. And so those self-neglect reports that you're seeing there are 31%. And the total allegations that went to counties, and this is calendar year 2019, were over 45,000 allegations. Not that many reports, because each report can have more than one allegation, but 45,000 allegations were divided up in that manner that you're seeing. So this is an age breakdown of self-neglect for 2019, the reports that went to counties only. And you can see that this is not a population breakdown, so it's not telling us the ratio of reports or alleged self-neglect per age group. It's just the flat reports. So in that breakdown, the highest reported group is the people between 40 and 64. But as when you see the total of the senior groups, when you break them down by total of seniors, you can see that the majority of the reports would be over age 65. And our unknown category is fairly high because oftentimes when people report to the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center, they don't know a lot about the individual, or they may not know a lot about the individual or have a specific age. So that's why we end up with a lot of folks in the unknown category. But that's, again, specific to self-neglect and those self-neglect reports. So you can see that the highest proportion are going for people that would fit the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day category. So what are some of the impacts on people of self-neglect? You can see this is research-based. This is for real. That it increases people's risk of nursing home placement. It increases their risk of going to the hospital or going to the emergency room, not just one, but multiple times, and is a risk for premature death. So there is no way to overemphasize how serious the impacts of self-neglect can be. There's also emotional impacts that aren't going to show up so much in a simple research study. Things like a person's self-concept, their feelings about themselves, their feelings about dignity and the dignity that they have internally, as well as the dignity that people in the community would ascribe to them based on some of the other risk factors that we were looking at. There's also impacts on people's finances and stress. So and grief. There's a lot of impacts on individuals who are self-neglecting, as well as being labeled self-neglecting. Both of those things have impacts for people. The condition as well as the label can both have impacts, but these are the actual outcomes that we can look at related to self-neglect. So the National Adult Protective Services Association is a professional association that provides guidance for adult protection. Adult protection also has guidance from the Administration for Community Living, which is a federal agency under the Health and Human Services that provides voluntary consensus guidelines for adult protection. And we won't get into all the details of those, but they are available, linked to our website. You can also Google them with the Administration for Community Living, and you can Google NAPSA to get more detail about their code of ethics. But when we're talking about that population of people that are reported as suspected to be neglecting their own necessary needs, they go to MARC, and then those reports go to the county. When the counties are responding to these, they are looking at the code of ethics that NAPSA provides for them. And this code has also been incorporated into the Department of Human Services policy guidance for adult protection. And you can see that, so make sure I didn't skip a slide. I did. there we go. So when adult protection is responding to adults who's vulnerable, who's neglecting their own necessary needs, they're looking at these principles, which are really safety, the individual's rights. All adults are presumed to have retain all their constitutional rights unless the court has made a decision otherwise. They have the right to make decisions that aren't consistent with societal norms, and they have a right to accept or refuse services. But that doesn't mean that adult protection is going to stop engaging with that individual if they refuse services. Adult protection is what I guess we would describe as an assertive service offering with people. A lot of times when people get to this point, it's because they've been telling their doctors and nurses and social workers and home care staff and everybody else, no, no, family, friends, no, no, no. So adult protection is going to come into the same situation without a lot of other tools. You can see they're respecting people's rights and their rights to refuse, but being assertive in the engagement that they have when people say no. There's going to be some ways that they respond to that, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. So we'll go this. You saw this previous, the guiding values for adult protection. And then we are going to talk a little bit more about the self-determination and the balance. And this is a really super slide. Thank you, Peter Larson, for the action of adult protection taking to balance individuals' rights with their self-determination and the duty to protect the vulnerable adult. And that's really what adult protection is a balance when you're working with people with self-neglect. You're balancing their rights and your duty to improve their safety and comfort and ensure that their necessary needs for food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and supervision are met. So it's a balance. Adult protection is really a person-centered service, and adult protection doesn't own these solutions here, but these are many of the ways that services are used to address neglect. Basic relationship building, engaging with the person, building a relationship that really can lead to some insights and solutions for that individual, helping them to improve their insight to the impacts of their decisions on themselves and their goals, and looking at those solutions. Also really exploring some of the barriers that people may have to having those basic needs met, either their own internal barriers or the external societal barriers, economic barriers, justice barriers that are keeping people from getting what it is that they need. Engaging support systems, looking at emergency services, home and community-based services, connecting people to medical and mental health care, housing, connecting people to housing, again, overcoming those barriers with a person-centered, assertive approach with the individual, as well as with all those barriers that they are addressing. Case management is another service that helps address neglect, and then supportive decision-making, which is a method of engaging supports around a person to get decisions made with that individual. So we offer the policy and procedures for counties and tribes that want to use this as a reference, as well as structured tools. So the department has structured tools that are guides to help county adult protection in response to MARC reports. They look at the allegation and is it something that meets the criteria for investigation or assessment response, the response time, the kinds of things to look at when you're assessing safety, when you're assessing a person's strengths and needs, to do safety planning, and then the assessment of safety before that intervention or case is closed. Those are all up on the website, whoops, as well. Oops, there, we're just jumping around. Sorry, I'm trying to run two screens and it doesn't seem to want to run two screens. So just, Sean asked us to talk about COVID impacts, and I'll just briefly say that, yes, there are significant impacts from COVID and how adult protection does their work. As Amanda talked about, we're all doing things virtually, and many county agencies have different ways that they are advising staff right now, but the department has advised that adult protection should conduct face-to-face assessments for intervention only when there's no other method to meet the critical health and safety needs of vulnerable adults. And that really is a big impact and a big change when we're looking at those engagement strategies. Engaging with the individual is really more challenging, as well as even assessing their needs first. When they're self-neglecting, assessing what's going on is more challenging when you're limiting face-to-face visits. So there's a lot of ways that adult protection is getting very creative in addressing how to do that assessment and engagement. And I'm gonna guess that the panelists will probably have a little something to say about that as well. So when we look at self-neglect, all those allegations that went to Mark, of those allegations, there were investigative decisions in 2019, made about 2,500 of them. So the year that the report comes in and the investigation decisions don't line up. So if you're on our website looking at the dashboard data, of which there's quite a bit, and there'll be more coming, when you're looking at that, you need to understand that investigations may not be completed in the year of the report, so those aren't going to line up one-to-one. But for self-neglect, there was over 2,500 investigative decisions, and of those, 511 were determined that that vulnerable adult was, yes, neglecting their own necessary needs. And 916 were false, 494 were inconclusive, and the remainder, 647, that a determination wasn't possible, either because when that assessment was opened, it was found the person didn't meet the criteria as a vulnerable adult, or the person was unable to be located. Most of those are the adult protection opened to offer services and then found the individual wasn't a vulnerable adult. So of those 511 vulnerable adults where adult protection offered interventions, there was 569 interventions. So people may receive more than one intervention because the interventions are person-centered, strengths-based interventions. Of those, you are seeing that the number one intervention that was offered was to move that individual or to relocate them to a place that they could get the services and supports that were needed. The next most common intervention, 12% of the people that received intervention, guardianship or conservatorship, then case management and service referrals, medical care and evaluation, health and welfare checks, and engaging support systems. So these are the top interventions that are recorded through adult protection. And the very interesting part when we have a system that focuses on did self-neglect happen, true, false, maybe not. What we find is that for individuals that it was inconclusive or false, they were getting substantial amounts of intervention and service referrals from adult protection in some of these same categories, as well as other categories. Other kinds of interventions that adult protection may offer for a person who is neglecting their own needs would be an MDT review to bring in those other disciplines and help them to think about that situation for a case consult. Emergency assistance for the individual, emergency food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, financial management assistance, min choices assessments, medical assistance applications, transportation assistance, chemical dependency assessments or interventions, all sorts of person-centered interventions depending on that person's needs and strengths. And that's really the way that we're changing how we look at self-neglect, is really focusing person-centered, trauma-informed, what happened in that person's life that they are where they are at this point in time, that what's wrong with them, what's their impairment, it's what happened to them, why are they here, how can we engage and use relationship building techniques to address the actual specific issue. And a lot of times that takes more visits, longer term interventions, multidisciplinary assistance. And what we find about involuntary interventions is that they have unintended consequences to that person's quality of life, to their rights. They're expensive. They may not resolve the issue. For instance, if the issue was multiple emergency room visits or lack of health care, that involuntary intervention may not resolve that. When the person's physically refusing or leaving or showing up at the emergency room all the way around, we find that involuntary interventions don't get at the root cause of the issue. So this slide is really to really focus on why we're thinking about redesigning the vulnerable adult protection system. When we look at all those 14,000 reports or allegations of self-neglect of a vulnerable adult in our state, when they get through the whole process, what we found is 4% of them were determined to have been neglecting their own needs. That does not mean that all those people in there that someone thought there was an issue or concern about, their necessary food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, supervision, that those were all fine. What we find is that we have a very, very low threshold for our statute, and that our response may not really be the response that people are looking for when we're talking about an investigative response, or when we're talking about a formal legal response through our government agencies. So we are taking a look at our adult protection system, as well as the funding for adult protection system, to look at the redesign. So we'll take a couple minutes to take a look at the redesign, which is focused on 626.557, that's the adult protection statute. And we've got a website that I'll show you at the end, and you'll have that in your materials as well, that you can go and take a look at it. And the goal of the redesign is to have a more equitable, culturally sensitive, and person-centered adult protection system, and shifting resources to service response for people who are vulnerable, and that really supports the dignity and justice for all adults in our state. So one of the way that we started was we had a landscape scope by PSC, which is Public Service Consultants. They're a public policy research and consulting firm in Lansing, Michigan. They did a thorough review of state and national policies, adult protection models, best practices, and interviewed a lot of stakeholders in the system, including local and national APS leaders. And they looked at promising tools and models and completed interviews with over 60 stakeholders. Some of you may be on the call that engaged in that part of the process, as well as other. And then they provided this report, which is on the website. That was the review of this best practices model. Then we went to engaging community stakeholders, institutional stakeholders, which would be all sorts of agencies and organizations that are involved in the system. We just, in March, completed the solution groups, which were groups that looked at the issues that came up in the first 3 phases and tried to do some solutionizing, and we'll talk about some of their high-level outcomes. And then we're going to be doing one more event, which was going to be an in-person event, but is now moved to a remote event, to take a look at all of these outcomes and get feedback from the stakeholders that have been involved in all the process as to if the outcomes match their expectations and are consistent with equity issues and cultural issues that we were hoping to address through this system. So these are some of the solution group outcomes that were really consistent with self-neglect. So they were pulled out for that particular, for this particular allegation of self-neglect. And that is that the language that we're using in our statute is not person-centered and is not conducive to engaging people in the system. Another recommendation from the intake and prioritization group was for adult protection to do some, to have the ability to do outreach and offer preventive services. Right now, that isn't in the scope for adult protection. We don't focus on prevention in our system. We focus on response to something that's happened and trying to prevent it from happening again. And so the highly supported from the solution groups was to change that focus in our statute. In collaboration and data sharing group, one of the completely supported suggestions was that we want adult protection, or they wanted adult protection to be able to share more information without consent of the vulnerable adult. So this runs into some data practices things, as well as some issues about people's rights that we'll have to sort through. And it may end up being something like we have now with our social service system, where social workers under their license can share data when it's necessary to provide services for the person's safety or to preserve their property or finances. So some of these solutions will still bring some challenges and are inconsistent with our current statute and also some other statutes when you're talking about data practices. But these are the recommendations, and we want to be taking them to the next phase, which we'll talk about in a second. So in the instance of self-neglect, a recommendation was that the response should not be an investigation. It should be an assessment of the individual's strengths and needs and an assessment response. And this is very much what child protection is doing through assessment response and consistent with collaborative safety, if you're familiar with that model, which is really looking at the second story and not looking at the kinds of focuses that you would have in investigation versus an assessment. So we have another phase to complete, as I said, with the feedback from the people who've been involved, and actually anyone is welcome to give feedback. If you go to the website, you'll be able to see that. And then really looking at proposal developments through the department or our partners and stakeholders to try and bring our statute more in line with the recommendations. So here's the website. Oops, that's a link, but it's on our partners and providers website. And it'll be a hyperlink, I believe, in the PDF that you receive. Also, you can contact us if you have questions about any of the things that we talked about, and our data also is linked into the website through our through the DHS website. And I am really excited now to turn things back over to the panel, who are experts in working with people who are vulnerable and neglecting their own needs, and I'll show you how some of these foundational concepts are turned into practice.
Mary, thank you so much. That was a great overview. And as we mentioned at the top, those slides will be sent out with other materials after today's presentation. Mary, before we introduce our panel, we did have a couple questions come through, I think specifically to your presentation, and a few others that we can wait for the panel to address. But let me ask you just a couple of quick ones. So back to total number of reports and kind of percentages of reports that are screened for self-neglect. If a case is screened out, I assume for any reason, does that mean nothing is being done to support the individual? Can you talk a little bit about what APS might do if they screen out a case?
Sure, and thank you for that question. That's really important. So it really depends, because our adult protection is delivered in 87 counties and some tribes. It really depends on the individual local practice, but but there is encouragement, and many counties do intensive work on that front end with the report. That kind of leads into the redesign, because there's some data practices issues and some statutory authority issues that, depending on each county attorney and their legal advice, how they interpret that. But many counties are doing a lot of work on those screened out reports. There's also a letter that they can send that includes resources. Many of them are providing advice and guidance to the reporter on how to resolve that issue. Some of those reports are referred to a case manager, because when the county goes in their system, they can see there's a case manager that they can involve. But again, that depends on the county's practices. But absolutely, reports that are not opened, so to say, open for assessment or investigation, may receive very intense services and are may be solved essentially at that intake level due to some good information, advice, consultation from the great adult protection workers that are on the intake.
Great. And then I think this one is also a good one that you can briefly address, and the panel might be able to touch on as well. Essentially, the question is asking, what if someone has a caregiver and there's kind of, there's allegations that there might be some neglect going on. If they have a caregiver, will there ever be self-neglect? What if the person is trying to give the best care, but they don't have enough, resources to provide for them, or the person is just flat out refusing to accept care? So where's that kind of line between caregiver neglect and self-neglect? Talk a little bit about how agencies make that determination.
Sure. So it's not always very clear when that report comes in, because the person who made that report may not have a lot of information, or they may have a misunderstanding about the relationship between the individual and the person who is providing care. So it is not always clear if there's caregiver neglect or self-neglect. And in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter as long as it's not a licensed provider where they're responsible for the care. When they're in a facility where they're responsible for a certain level of care and they're not providing it, obviously that's neglect. When a person's in the community making their own decisions, there's multiple issues. One may be, does the informal caregiver have an understanding about what they undertook? Did they agree to undertake it? Are they getting paid for it? Are they doing this out of the goodness of their heart? Is the individual cooperating or not? So those are all really important issues that adult protection is looking at during their fact finding or during their assessment to figure out what's going on, what are the issues, what are the barriers, and how can we get that person the food, shelter, clothing, health care, and supervision that they need for their health, safety, and comfort, regardless of who may be responsible. But you may not know initially, and it may take a lot of work to figure out all that information.
And I think you touched on this a little bit, but that's also going to be part of the redesign in terms of helping clarify that even in statute a little bit, because it's a really tricky decision for an adult protection worker and their colleagues to make.
It is, and we've got other parts of our system that are encouraging people to assume informal responsibilities, either as when someone has a PCA for that plan, or even for people that are receiving other services in our medical assistance system. We're encouraging people to take on informal supports for individuals, and we need that as a society, and people want to do that. But where is the line when someone assumes that responsibility to not then be neglecting that individual's needs? When is it the individual? When is it the other person?
And one more, and then let's introduce our panel. So I think you also picked up on this a little bit in the data discussion of the redesign. I think I heard you say that current data practices law is a thicket and sometimes prevents the sharing of reports. The questioner just wanted to know, are APS reports available to other case managers? I think non-APS case managers who are involved working with the client. And what can people currently share, and then what do you think the data solutions group says about the future of sharing?
Sure. So what we currently can share, when that MARC report is made, it's confidential, and how each county's APS determines that is really up to them, because they are also, they're part of a social service system, but they're really relying on their legal counsel as to whether or not it can be shared with the case manager, and who the case manager is, and are they part of that human service system, or are they external case manager? So it's I can't give you an answer, because those answers are coming from each county's data practices official. The redesign was very clear that they want data to be able to be shared in order to protect the individual, and so that's going to be a very challenge to balance that with our current data practices laws, which are linked into the Adult Protection, to the Vulnerable Adult Act, as well as external. So we have data practices laws linked in, as well as specific data practices within the statute. So how that's going to work, plus balancing people's rights for privacy, it's going to be a challenge.
Great, thank you. Katie, let's go ahead and bring up our other panelists, and I'd ask Mary that you stay on as well, because I think you may be able to kind of weigh in throughout the conversation as we go on here. So I'm very happy to introduce three panelists that we have joining us today: Corinne Graham, Lori Halber, and Sherry Besdick. And I'm going to turn it over to them kind of one by one. And what I'd like for each of you to do is go ahead and first just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your position in your organization and the work your organization does. And then if you could talk a little bit about how you personally and your organization meet with or work with individuals who are alleged to be self-neglecting, or who there has been some concerns about. So for this opening round, we'll give you about 5 minutes each, and then I'll move us on to questions. We have about 45 minutes together to talk and share, and then we will open it up at the end to further questions that we have coming in. So Corinne, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome, and go ahead and get started.
Hi, I'm Corinne Graham. I'm from Clay County Social Services. I am the adult protection worker for Clay County. So my job basically is I get the MARC reports, I screen them with my team, and I am the boots on the ground going out, investigating, interviewing, connecting with people vulnerable adults in the community that are neglecting themselves, and trying to work with them to get them to accept services, to reduce their neglect, harm reduction, and just trying to find, in our area, we can be very rural, trying to find the services and informal supports, and engage people to help the vulnerable adults in their area, and just try to improve quality of life based on, you know, what the vulnerable adult wants and what their needs are.
And just to give attendees a little more flavor about your specific situation, can you talk about how big your adult protection unit is, and then kind of generally how much coverage you're doing, and then a little bit more kind of about the demographics of the population that you're serving?
Well, Clay County is pretty much rural. Moorhead, Minnesota is the biggest town with maybe 40,000 people. We're very rural. We do not have a hospital in our county. So our hospital's in North Dakota, in Fargo. So we cross the state lines quite a bit to meet with people. Our office is with adult protection. It's 1.5 adult protection workers. So I'm the full-time adult protection worker, and we have a part-time person who has another job besides adult protection. Honestly, I think like last year we had over 400 reports, and we did probably 170 investigations, with the majority of them being done by me. So we're pretty rural, a lot of small town communities.
Great. Thank you. And we'll come back for that expertise as well. So Lori, welcome. And again, thanks so much for joining us. You bring a little different perspective from your day in, day out work. So go ahead and tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So again, my name is Lori Halber, and I am with Catholic Charities Homeless Elders Program. Our Homeless Elders Program has been around for a little over 10 years now. For about the first 7 years, though, it was just one person in St. Paul and one person in Minneapolis managing that, and there was just a bunch of revolving funding sources to keep this program going at that time. In 2016, we were awarded a DHS Live Well at Home grant, which was very exciting. We've been able to increase our staffing by 3, so we are now a team of 5 split between both sides of the river. And then that in turn has helped us reach a lot more clients. We all of us on our team carry a caseload of about 15 to 20 people at a given time, and we do some intensive case management with them. We also spend a lot of time doing some advocacy work, and then developing trainings to give to both Catholic Charities staff, and then also taking on the road out into the community. We also developed a training manual that we really were invested in for our housing sites and our shelters and our drop-ins, who had lots of questions on how to work with older adults and what services and things that they could do with them. So that practice manual we have, and we also send it out to people in the community when they ask at this time. What we really do is this intensive case management. We start by meeting with our clients and doing, an intensive assessment, doing the client-centered goals, really walking with them, alongside them through their processes. Sometimes we're just starting with helping them meet some immediate medical needs, or gathering documents like ID, social security cards, birth certificates. We develop housing plans with everyone we work with. What that involves kind of discussing what is your dream housing, and then balancing that with the reality of the housing market, their incomes, their credit problems, their other personal barriers such as their criminal backgrounds, evictions, and if they need some support once they get to that housing. We do a lot of advocacy with landlords, many appeals. A lot of our clients get denied on their first try. We always say a denial doesn't mean you're not getting that housing. That means we're going to do a few extra steps and appeal it. And they're very effective. We really do a good job of making sure that we're connecting people with kind of the services, supplies, equipment that they need so that they can maintain that housing. And so that's our selling point with all of those landlords. We're connecting people with insurance, waivers, food support, furniture for when they get in their housing, and then other support systems. And a lot of times that means even connecting them with family that they've become disconnected from. We usually stay with them for about 3 to 6 months after we get them housed, while we're connecting them with all those supports and services and doing some warm handoffs to those new workers that are going to be involved in their lives. I just want to talk a little bit, we have, as we know, when people age, they have a lot of kind of unique challenges. But when people are homeless, those unique challenges can be really problematic. And some of those deal with kind of their health issues, and it's really hard to manage those when you're homeless, setting up and managing appointments, getting your medications, replacing your medications after they've been stolen, and following treatment plans that you're expected to follow. People that are aging also have really those decreased senses. And so if you have difficulty with sight or hearing, it's really hard to maneuver the systems, the homeless systems. The Wilder study that just came out in 2018, they let out some new data this last month specific to older adults. And one of those pieces noted that 45% of the people that are over the age of 50 experiencing homelessness are first-time homeless. So with these decreased kind of senses, it's hard to learn these new skills. A lot of our clients have difficulty navigating technology, can't even don't know how to use cell phones or computers. And if you've ever applied for apartments lately, so much of that is now online. And then they're at a greater risk for assault, theft. They're targeted for their incomes when they're in shelter. They're befriended by less than honorable folks around them. All too often we see them sending money overseas to girlfriends or other scams, which really is horrible. And then their incomes are limited because most of them are unable to work due to age and disability. Their risk of self-neglect really goes up, and I'm just going to share a few numbers with you from that Wilder study. In 2018, they interviewed 1,054 elders over the age of 55, and 75% of them reported that they have chronic physical health conditions, 49% have serious mental health conditions, and 24% have substance abuse disorder. And out of those three categories, 16% of the people said they have all three. So just think about how that really would increase somebody's risk for neglecting themselves. And then about over 1/3 of them reported cognitive impairments, and then 90% overall have serious or chronic disabilities. So we really see that self-neglect occurring when people are refusing assistance to kind of manage all of those unique challenges and vulnerabilities. And it's really difficult when they have all of those kind of added conditions.
Thank you. That's a very helpful overview. Just real quick, from the Wilder study, and maybe you don't have this right in front of you, but my understanding is we are seeing an increase in the pure numbers of homeless older adults in our community. Is that accurate? If so, just briefly, kind of what among your organization, kind of what are your brainstorm beyond what you do day in, day out to kind of address that?
So it was a 25% increase from 2015 to 2018 for people
Okay.
over the age of 55, which is huge. And with that, we're really noticing even like more vulnerable people that are experiencing, you know, some of those, you know, the mental health, the physical health, all that, but people that are coming out of nursing homes, AMA, you know, that have mobility issues, can barely get around, have incontinence issues, aren't able to bathe and groom kind of on their own, and now they're in our shelter system. And so we're finding a lot of difficulty with that. You know, we were super excited back in 2016 when we were able to grow as a program, but our waiting list for our program is actually getting longer, where there's a longer waiting time from the time people are referred to us till we can actually get to them, just because those numbers are increasing so quickly.
Well, thanks again for being here, and thanks for lending your expertise. And we'll get back to you with a couple questions here in just a little bit. So Sherry, tell us a little bit more about your role in adult protection, and as your unique role as a supervisor, how do you kind of interact with those who may be at risk of self-neglecting?
Yeah, hi. I'm Sherry Bezdacek, just to actually
Sorry.
pronounce it. That's okay. That's okay. It's a lot of consonants. And I supervise the Adult Protection Unit here at Ramsey County, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. So pretty large county. We have a staff of 8 adult protection workers, and we're sort of a unique county, and we don't plan to stay this way, but all of our workers do both intake and investigation. So we have kind of a rotating schedule of people on intake, and those same people also get investigations, which is probably more similar to some of the smaller rural counties. And we actually were about to be in process to split that up, and then COVID hit, and so that's sort of been prolonged. So all of my staff do both intake and investigations. And my role really is to be supervising. I, on a regular basis, review the intake, so the referrals that come in to us, as well as meeting with staff on a regular basis about their assigned cases. You know, one of the things that I would say that our county is really focused on, Mary talked about this a little bit, but really from the get-go at the time of intake, making sure that people meet that criteria as a vulnerable adult. I think we are pretty strong in representing that we don't get involved in people's lives if we don't have a right to, if they really don't meet that category or that criteria as a vulnerable adult. And then as far as self-neglect goes, really looking at my background really is in disabilities. I was a mental health case manager, a pre-petition screener, a caddy waiver worker, and so really come from that that strength-based person-centered planning and thinking, and really kind of trying to understand what people's values are, and working with that and honoring that, and that balance, which is probably the most difficult thing in self-neglect, is what is the balance between providing for safety and what is the balance for understanding who is this person, how has this person lived their whole life, what are their choices, and how do we honor those choices regarding their supports or not wanting to have supports, or what that looks like. And, you know, constantly thinking outside of the box. And I was thinking about the thinking outside of the box in approach to our self-neglect cases, and I thought, you know, what is inside the box when we think about outside of the box? What's inside of the box? And I think it really is the balance that we talk about in self-neglect, because I think inside the box is safety, preservation of life, statutes, laws, rules, and outside of that box is looking at what people's, who are they? What has been their life? What have been their choices and preferences? And so in working with my staff, one of the things that's really important is that we understand who a person is, because in person-centered thinking and planning, we talk so much about what's important to a person and what's important for a person. And really, in order to connect someone to what's important for them, if they are not seeing it or don't want it, you have to tie it to something that's important to them. And so a lot of that is about relationship building and really understanding the person and where they come from. So I think that's the way we're trying to look at a lot of these cases that are coming in for self-neglect.
Wonderful, thanks. It is that's a great start to kind of get us jumping in here. So I want to pick up on that theme. We heard Mary talk about it as well, about this difficult balancing act between, sometimes it's known as, the dignity of risk or somebody's autonomy, the ability to make poor decisions, versus that when that line is crossed and they're actually putting themselves or others, especially themselves, at danger, and that balancing act that you have to approach in all of your jobs. So I want to start with the adult protection professionals, Corrine and Sherry. Can you reflect on, and I'd also like to kind of get more get a little bit more specific here to help the attendees really kind of take some of these concepts that we've talked about and really put a name and a face to it, albeit an anonymous name and anonymous face. But can you each talk or reflect about a case that you've worked on where that autonomy versus safety issue was really difficult to work with, and some of those creative strategies that you or your adult protection team employed to kind of help manage that balance, because sometimes those creative strategies are the only interventions we have. So Corrine, you want to go first? Sherry, your choice.
Corrine.
Corrine, go ahead and take yourself off mute. There you go.
I was going to say, go ahead, Sherry. It's so many. One case I kind of keep going back to, and it was months of working with, is an elderly woman who has Alzheimer's, was living on her own. Her caregiver / brother had passed away, and between the two of them, they were able to kind of manage things. And after he passed away, things just went downhill for her. And she wanted to stay in the house that she didn't own, and she wanted, to keep her dogs, and there was these 3 dogs, and the house wasn't hoarded, but it was very cluttered and unkept, and she had, personal hygiene wasn't the greatest, and things, and it took getting her screened for services and getting her on elderly waiver, and trying to help her to stay in the home because that's what she wanted. But eventually, through the process of working with her and connecting her with outside providers, like LSS has a wonderful program in our area where they have aging life coordinators that helped manage appointments and taking her to her appointments, and working with doctors, and taking her myself to appointments so that we could get services set up, and going and shoveling her sidewalk and shoveling it so that her door could close. I mean, and grabbing one of my coworkers that was young to help me with that. The end result was, I got her on some elderly waiver and stuff, and the house was foreclosed on and she had to move. But through that process, we did get her to an assisted living. And it wasn't what she originally wanted, but what needed to happen. And we were able to do all of that without getting a guardianship in place, because she was willing to accept services and work with people. And we just got very creative with, engaging her neighbor, who was the one person she would call and ask for assistance, and looking for the outside resources, until in getting her used to the fact that, okay, your house, you're going to have to move. You're going to have to move. We're going to have to do something with these dogs. What are we going to do with the dogs? And bringing those things back to her. I got bit by one of the dogs. I mean, it was a mess. And, but through it all, we wound up with a very good ending of her being in an assisted living and thriving again. And we did it all without a guardianship, with somebody that was having capacity issues. And that was all down to her being able and willing to accept services and wanting the help.
So Sherry, I know that you have kind of similar stories, maybe not in details, but in type. And as you share with us, one of those also reflect a little bit on some of, especially from an APS supervisor standpoint, how are you supporting your workers, and how are, folks in the field like Corrine, and Corrine, you can jump in here too, being supported to kind of make these difficult decisions about, am I doing the right thing? Should I be spending this much time on a case? When do I know that enough is enough? Those kind of, difficult questions, because unfortunately, we've funded APS for so long to be kind of that triage system, that immediate, system. But I think what we're hearing from Mary, and I think what we're going to hear, is that self-neglect cases are long, complex, difficult, and they take a lot of patience and trust to be built up. So how do you balance that, those demands on top of the actual work of balancing autonomy and safety?
Yeah, and I think that's it's a really important question about the autonomy and safety piece, and even really the autonomy as we go along in working with folks on these self-neglect cases. At what point do we decide that we've sort of met enough safety that we allow people to have autonomy back? And so really for me, that's an ongoing conversation with staff in our supervision. Where are we at? Where do we go? How long are we going to be involved? Some are fairly straightforward, where someone has no services and they really need that connection to the services, and what we're helping them do is either get on medical assistance or get a service assessment. And once that's completed and we know they've been approved for services, then we kind of let those services take over and we close out and hope that that's going to be the case. I think the more difficult ones are situations like right now we have a newly assigned case of a 74-year-old woman. I'm sorry, is she 7? Yeah, 74-year-old woman who lives with her husband, lives in a pretty safe neighborhood outside of downtown St. Paul. They own their own home, and she does have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and she's somewhat familiar to us. We've had about 5 intakes. We've opened investigations on 3 different occasions in trying to support her husband, really, with trying to get them connected to services. They don't qualify for medical assistance, so they would be private pay service. And the more recent referrals that we have received are because neighbors are concerned that they see this woman in the neighborhood, and she doesn't seem to necessarily always know where she is. She's asking people for directions. And what we found out through opening for investigation to try to see if we can work with the client and her husband on services is that she used to be a runner. And so she is trying to get out of the home every day. Her preference is to walk 10 miles per day. And her husband is also elderly, so he can't always accompany her. He has put some safety precautions in place, like he makes sure that she leaves the house with a cell phone. It has tracking on it, but she doesn't always answer her phone. He was a Vietnam vet, and they need to work through kind of the VA services, potentially about getting both of them into an assisted living. But he's not really ready for that. And he talks about how this is the one thing that she always loved. So it's very difficult for him to try to keep her from running. or walking. So we're trying to be creative as he kind of works through how does he sell his house, how does he, get increased services for them, how do we keep her safe in the meantime. So my staff person is reaching out to a running club to see if there's anybody that would be willing to volunteer sometime to run with her. She also was a teacher, so we maybe can reach out to the Teachers Association to see if people would be willing to volunteer time. But some of these are really about how involved do we get. When my investigator spoke with the client, she didn't really understand what services meant and what they were talking about. The husband is hesitant about bringing strangers into the home because apparently someone from their church befriended his wife and got her to sign a check for $55,000 to donate to a relief organization out of the country. So, he's kind of gun shy about having strangers in the home. So there's lots of complicating factors. And in this particular situation, nothing has happened yet, quote unquote. There are concerns about her crossing the street. But these are the kind of just super gray, like, could something happen at any time that she's out running / walking? Potentially. Is it enough that we say, husband, we don't think that you're making good decisions, she's not making good decisions, we file for guardianship? I don't think we're to that point yet, but these are kind of some of the ongoing conversations with every bit of new information that you get. How do things change in one direction or another? And just constantly having to reevaluate that autonomy versus that safety. And it never really stays the same. Like it kind of changes in one direction or another. And it's about constant conversation, I think, about how things are changing.
Thanks. Yeah, that's earlier when Mary was talking, really kind of asked, audience member asked that difficult question of, how do you tell if this is a caregiver issue or the self-neglect issue? Lori, I want to come back to you now, and because I think you have similar types of experiences and similar types of stories and similar types of creative solutions, but you're coming at it from a different perspective. You're not a government agency. You're not kind of mandated or governed by the Vulnerable Adult Act, and you have some other kind of considerations when you are thinking and trying to serve individuals who may be self-neglecting. So what the way I kind of wanted to phrase it to you was, we've talked a lot about your work, and I've heard you and your colleagues say, sometimes that was a successful case, sometimes that was an unsuccessful case. So I think you have a really good juxtaposition about what makes successful and unsuccessful from the standpoint of cases where it's, maybe a difficult self-neglect case. Could you walk us through kind of your day-to-day work with individuals and maybe give us an example of what makes a successful case, what makes an unsuccessful case, at least in your agency's determination?
Yeah, for sure. I have a couple or I've got an example of, each of those. I'll start with kind of the not so successful case first. I was working with a guy for a couple of years. He was initially referred to our program due to financial exploitation. An adult protection report had already been filed for that. And separately, Social Security had actually already put a hold on his account with them because of concerns that they saw and requested a rep payee to be set up. So that's where we started. And then the other information I was given right off was that he had a brain injury. Well, it turned out on top of the brain injury, he really, really had symptoms of dementia also. He had no short-term memory. He wasn't able to remember any details. And it would actually get really angry when I couldn't help him. One example of this is he had loaned somebody some money to buy a car, and he called that guy the kid. And then the kid crashed the car, had to go to jail, and he wanted the money back. And he would ask me about this multiple times every day, and you know, I would try to extract some more information like, well, what's the name of the kid? I don't know, he's just a kid. He's in jail. You'll be able to find him. And would get really, really mad at me. And then he'd go away and come back like a half hour later. We gotta get that money from the kid. You know, and so we were able to complete a full neuropsych workup, and that did confirm that he had lack of short memory and inability to create or follow through with a plan. And I was really hopeful, like, we've now got this in place. You know, I can call adult protection again and get them involved. And it wasn't quite enough. He had some physical health stuff with being unable to manage medications, appointments, any follow through on any treatment plans, or even like identify when he was sick. One time he had a foot injury that took it took months for it to heal because he just kept re-injuring it. Another time he had like sores in his mouth that were bleeding, sores on his skin that were bleeding, and it turned out his platelet count was like 3. He ended up in the hospital for several days, 7 blood transfusions, and not once could he identify that he was sick to us. He has long-term alcohol use and abuse, which just complicates matters even more. He becomes verbally and physically aggressive when he's been drinking. That's oftentimes gotten him restricted from being able to use shelter. And then he even gets into physical altercations with strangers on the street because of it. He's unable to manage his finances. He's got that rep payee in place, but is confused about what that means, who that is. He forgets that money's deposited on his card each week. He forgets the PIN number. He loses the card. He gives the card to friends to buy things for him, and then gets angry that they're stealing his money. He refuses housing. Any housing type I've offered him, he's always refused. We tried doing a couple placements in nursing homes and assisted livings. The longest he lasted was a couple of days. He would just break out even if they were locked. When I asked him, like, what's your ideal housing? He said, I just want to stay in shelter, you know, and we try to explain, well, shelter isn't a place to live. It's a place to stay while you're looking for housing. But again, he doesn't have an ability to plan or short-term memory, so doesn't understand that concept. What I found myself the entire time I worked with him was just hours and hours of crisis management, spinning my wheels, not getting anything done. You know, I would be getting him clean and weather appropriate clothing constantly. And the next time I'd find him, I'd say, where's your winter coat? He'd be wearing a jean jacket. Oh, I like this jacket better. It looks better. You know, and it's 20 below zero. So some really scary stuff like that. You know, calling his rep payee and getting new debit cards sent, taking him to doctor's appointments, negotiating with shelter and drop in. You know, can we get him to stay another night? Let's give it another try. He did have some family involvement. He had a son who was local, but he had a brain injury. And then he also had his own chemical health issues, which were triggered when his dad was drinking. And then he had 2 daughters who lived in California that were estranged. And that really bothered him. He didn't understand that. You know, I want to call my daughters. Well, you don't have their phone number. I'll get their phone number. Well, they don't really want to talk to you. So that was really difficult. Guardianship was eventually approved, and I thought that was going to be the golden ticket, but they just really couldn't provide the support that he needed. He wasn't agreeable to anything. So I just feel like he's really vulnerable and falling through the cracks. And he's currently back in shelter, staying there right now. So that's my not so successful story. We did work with another individual. He was actually referred from another homeless outreach organization. They thought that our older adult expertise would be helpful with this client. He was staying in a wooded area by some dumpsters behind a large big box store in downtown. He was in a wheelchair due to losing all of his toes to frostbite. So obviously self-neglect wasn't new to him. When we first saw him, he was wearing several layers of jackets, even though the weather was really hot. He was unable to manage toileting or bathing, possibly due to lack of restroom. We didn't really know. He was lacking medication that controlled his seizures. And then he also had a long history of using alcohol. He told us he mostly stayed outdoors days and nights with friends, again, friends that helped him get around and get some of his needs met, but who also consistently stole his belongings and medications from him. Initially, he refused any coming into shelter or any nursing home care. He just wanted his own apartment. Luckily, about that same time, he was referred to a low-income apartment in Minneapolis called Minnehaha Commons. So we thought, this is great. We'll just get him a few papers and he'll be well on his way. It turned out to be a lot more difficult than that. His only identification that he had was a hospital bracelet and a Social Security benefit letter. We found that we couldn't transport him in our vehicles because of the unmanaged incontinence. His clothes were just covered with urine and feces every time we saw him. We were able to meet with him a few times and complete some paperwork. We, visited him just to check in on him, provide him with a few supplies, but we were really stuck, unable to just accomplish much with him. He eventually was in and out of the hospital the next few months a few times, and we were able to get some other partners to join in with us. And that worked out really well. During that time, we completed multiple adult protection reports, kind of each time that he went into the hospital for kind of an altered mental state without really doing any treatment. He injured a hand, he was assaulted. We had no results kind of turn out from that, but the provider from his clinic was able to provide us with a certified medical record. And one day when he was clean and sober, another partner from Healthcare for the Homeless was able to bring him to Social Security. We met him there with that certified medical document and were able to order him a Social Security card. So it was kind of our first big success. He then agreed to some temporary placement in a skilled nursing facility after he had another emergency room visit. At that time, Touchstone Mental Health met with him and completed some more housing paperwork. St. Stephen's wheeled him to a caddy assessment down the street. We were able to get his mail to him, including that new Social Security card. And we were also able to help him complete some other verifications that he needed to get into his new housing. At that point, the only thing he still needed was his state ID card. That was the last kind of piece of document that we needed to help him get. And then the Alliance Hayes Gifton Property Management Company that oversees Minnehaha Commons agreed to make an exception with just the agreement that we would work on getting that ID after he was housed. So that day, Touchstone staff picked him up from the skilled nursing facility and took him to his new apartment, signed the lease, set up the caddy services to help him maintain that housing. They set up a bridging appointment for him. We brought him over a household basket to get him started so that bridging appointment was able to happen. And he was in his own house, which was just beautiful for a man that, really didn't look like there was a lot of hope.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for kind of sharing those stories. I know when I hear these types of stories, I think I go back to Mary's slide where she had 500 cases or so in Minnesota last year where there was found to be self-neglect, and then many others that weren't or were screened out for whatever reason. And behind each of those numbers is potentially a story, as tricky and difficult, needing the care and attention, Lori, that you talked about, and others. And that's when the scope of this particular issue to me starts to hit home. How even if the numbers don't jump off the page to you, which they do to me, the complexities of these cases definitely jump off the page. And so thanks for sharing those. There's one more question that I want all of you to reflect on. But before we get to that, we've had a couple of really good ones come through our Q&A. And because we're kind of talking about the balance of autonomy and safety, and because we are talking about some of these real specific kind of how do you balance these cases, I wanted to address two of these real quick. So and Katie, if you could bring Mary McGurn back online too, she might have a couple of thoughts. So the first one is kind of I guess a quote unquote simple one, but it's important because I think probably a lot of our attendees face this question, especially if they are a mandated reporter. Essentially, the questioner's worried about a older couple who lives in independent living, but it's I think connected probably to an assisted living, and one of the individuals is starting to show quite a few signs of medical decline, but the caregiver really isn't kind of necessarily stepping in, and probably some complications around eventually needing to move and get more help. The main crux of the question is, if we're starting to see some of these real daily changes and challenges, and there's some need for some supervision, and it's not always being provided, and it's needed at 24-hour, when does this become a self-neglect issue, and is this something that's reportable? So anybody can weigh in on that.
I would say, if you have concerns, make a report. I mean, it's not up to the reporter to decide if it's neglect or abuse, or if this person's a vulnerable adult. That's up to the screening teams and to make those decisions. So if you're questioning if you should make a report or not, just make the report.
And Mary, can you just walk us through real quick, if for any reporter, mandated or not, kind of what to expect when you actually call, the MARC line, and we'll put that number will be in your materials as well.
Well, as a mandated reporter, I would encourage them to use the web reporting system first, because it's really designed for mandated reporters. And I agree with Kareen 100% that if they suspect that, they should make a report. What they can also be doing as people that work in that facility that are in a position to have a relationship and develop a relationship with this couple is to really continue to engage. Because as you heard from Sherry and Kareen and Lori, that's really the only thing that makes a difference for people, is to engage with them and help them to get better insight onto what's going on and what their options are and the impacts. And that's really the responsibility of the professionals around that person. So anyone who's working in that environment or their home care agency can be working with that couple to help to understand what the needs are in the family, maybe a family conference. The bottom line for reporting would be, if her necessary food, shelter, clothing, or the supervision that's needed to maintain her health and safety is not there when he's sick, then that should be reported. But there's so many ways to address that prior to that crisis, or even in the midst of that crisis, to try and mitigate the harmful impacts of that for both of them. That's a difficult situation, because he's probably feeling really responsible for her and worried about her, and he's probably worried about money and all those sorts of things. So there's just so many dynamics that really need to be addressed to really connect and to end up with supporting that couple, in addition to making the report if you suspect that necessary needs are not being met.
Thank you. And here's the other one. Reflect just a little bit on this, anybody. If an adult chooses to live in home, but they don't have any running water, or the use of sewer or even garbage, at what point is that person no longer, quote unquote, able to, quote unquote, be safe there? And those are kind of the only facts presented, but start to unpack a situation like that, if that would be your case.
So, obviously the first thing we would need to probably understand about the individual is, do they have capacity, and do they understand the choices that they're making? That's a big piece, is whether there's capacity or isn't capacity. Certainly, though, we would look at those as basic needs. If there's no running water, there's no sewer. I've seen situations like that come through our door. We've gone out and we've talked to the person, and the person had started to have some cognitive decline and didn't really know how to go through the steps of calling a plumber, and some of those different things, and so we connected. I think the challenge runs in that you might run into is if they have cognitive capacity and they do understand, and they say, it's fine, I can use a bucket, and I'll dump a bucket in the backyard, and I have bottles of water, and this works for me. so at a certain point you have to decide, and again, weighing costs and benefits about bringing in code enforcement. Is it a situation that you would bring in code enforcement to, have a violation in which you would hopefully encourage them to work with you? But certainly I'd start with a conversation and figuring out if they understand their choices at the very first of it.
I would completely agree. I was, the whole time I was thinking, like, okay, they could have not running water in the garbage, but how are they meeting that basic need? I mean, are they bringing water in? Are they next to a gas station? They're using that bathroom to meet that need. And if they have the capacity to make those decisions, and, and then looking on, if they have the capacity and they're doing these things and they don't want adult protection assistance, our hands are tied at times. So then it's, looking at the code enforcement, the city laws. You in Clay County, Moorhead, you cannot be in a residence if there's no running water. It's one of the codes, and we've had to use that to get people to become safer, or to get them out of these dangerous situations where there's houses hoarded, there's no running water, there's no other way of trying to protect or get those needs met, and it's by sometimes relying on your county officials and city officials and enforcing those codes.
Thank you. Good thoughts. We have about 15 minutes left, and we do have plenty of questions coming in that will take us all the way up to the end of our time. And I will encourage everyone, contact information for all our panelists, as well as our office, will be available again in the materials. So if you want to follow up individually, especially if you have individual questions that you think might be one of the panelists can address, that'd be great. But here's the last one that I want to ask you, and then I'll get back to our Q&A. It hasn't just been COVID that our community has been dealing with. The recent killing of George Floyd by a police officer has really renewed, our national debate on racial inequities and other inequities as well. So can you talk a little bit about how specifically structural racism and structural racial inequalities can exacerbate all of these self-neglect issues that we've been talking about? You can maybe talk about what communities are maybe in your jurisdiction that are the hardest hit by self-neglect, or what are some of the other compounding factors that make the intensity of a self-neglect case based on even worse because of our racial disparities, especially in Minnesota. I'll open up to anybody.
That's a huge question, and I can think of an example of kind of how COVID and racial cultural inequalities plays out in that, we were receiving some reports and of folks who do not speak English, and our interpreters were not going out to do face-to-face interpreting, which made it very challenging. We were trying to utilize, the phone, but it did not work well. So those particular, groups were definitely impacted when we're receiving information about self-neglecting. We have concerns about COVID. We have concerns that we can't communicate. One of the things that was brought up for me is, what are we doing to educate communities that don't speak English about COVID? How are they finding out that COVID is going on, and what the precautions are? That particular referral had a large number of family members living together, and one working and going out and coming back. So, I just thought, what has been done to educate that community, and the difficulty when we couldn't be seeing people face to face, which also was affecting our interpreters going out face to face.
And on a bigger level, a policy level, we really lack data to understand the impacts of race and the impacts of people that are immigrants and other come from other places here in our system. So we're really working hard at the department to try and get that kind of data put together. We've got a grant from the Administration for Community Living to enrich our data reporting. So we're hoping to be able to provide that kind of data, and it's really up to researchers to pick up that data and take a look at it compared to our the age groups and race groups that we have in Minnesota, and figure out, is it equitable or is it not? Data is really important on the facts. On a basic level, we know that a system that depends on reporting to the government is going to be a system that is not speaking to every community. We know that. We also know that a system that's intertwined so closely with our criminal justice system, as over half of the MARC reports also go to law enforcement under our statute because it could potentially be a crime. A system that combines like that is not equitable, because we know that those systems are absolutely not equitable. We know that. We also know that there's certain groups in our country, in our state, racial groups that have higher rates of dementia. That's going to be more likely to have them into our system. We know that certain groups are more or less likely, based on education, to do well on standardized testing, which is why adult protection doesn't endorse standardized testing for determining whether or not someone has the ability to make their own decisions. We also know that definitions that deal with financial exploitation, when you're talking about a family situation, are not consistent with community and cultural beliefs about sharing and who owns what. So we have that issue. We know that groups that are more likely to be poor are going to have more challenges with getting food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and supervision in our system. We know that more people that are on medical assistance programs are ending up reported to the MARC. That's a very high factor. So it's a system that's really bringing people that have low income under the spotlight of the government, for good or not. I mean, you can make your own assessment as to what the outcomes are for that. But the system is not equitable by the design and development, and by how it intersects with economic, medical assistance, criminal, all those things.
Well said, Mary.
Oh, very well said, and a good summary. Lori, did you have anything else to add? I do have a couple questions for you next. So.
Yeah, and I just really see, when it comes to that whole self-determination, if somebody's in their house, they might get to go a lot longer with making poor choices, because it doesn't affect as many things. And so when you are displaced and homeless, once you start making bad choices in that environment, it just compounds very quickly.
So we're going to just kind of go rapid fire Q&A as much as we can. We've had some great stuff come in. Lori, I'm going to turn it over to you for a couple thoughts. I think we probably have several people who maybe interact with some of these difficult cases with the older adults who are experiencing homelessness. And so 2 questions that came up. One is, can you talk a little bit about going back to your opening statement, you talked about winning or losing appeals related to housing. Can you talk about some of the main reasons that older adults are denied housing and how you win those appeals? And then relatedly, how do you help somebody with a criminal history, which seems to be a big barrier for a lot of folks?
Yeah, so just addressing appeals to start with. One is really, really focusing on applying to places that you're meeting the criteria, the minimum kind of criteria. If a place says we will not take any evictions in the last 10 years, you can't apply to, well, you can, but you're going to get denied and you're not going to have much of a chance for appeal. And your client will lose hope from that you can't do your job very quickly. So really focusing on that discussion. Here's some of the places that you will qualify for. And some of those discussions are hard for people to take, but it's the reality of their situation. you know, when I do an appeal, one of the things that I always do is I talk to the client about a client statement. I talk about just depending on their abilities, like they're going to field you some questions. Are you going to be comfortable taking that? And then I think, am I going to be comfortable in how they're going to answer that when we're in that room? And, you know, oftentimes try to get people to write their statement out so that when they get in that room, they can read it. And it can be something that we've pre-thought together from, you know, things that they've told me. The other thing I do is I always write a letter of recommendation, and then I read that letter of recommendation to my client and say, I'm going to read this to you, and if there's anything you don't agree with or you want me to change, let me know. In any case that I have done that, sometimes you can just tell as I'm reading it, it is the first time that anybody has heard anything positive said about them in a very long time. It kind of renews their hope that that this appeal might actually work. And it just really builds our trust in our relationship. And then the big thing that, you know, that I always tell the people I'm working with, what do landlords want to know? They want to know that you're going to pay your rent on time and that you're going to be a good tenant. And so we need to convince them of these two things. I always, if they have a history of not paying their rent on time, I say, I try to put in there, like, how about a rep payee? If you get a rep payee, you take out that first, you know, they never have to be concerned that you're going to pay your rent on time. Or I say, if they're completely against it, I say, can we put it in as an offer if they're reluctant because of that? And so really kind of push that. And then, you know, we just have to tell every good reason why they're going to be a good tenant. And that really involves getting kind of the supports in place to help them be a good tenant. You know, if a landlord knows they have somebody to call when the tenant isn't being a good tenant, that is a huge difference. So that's what I have to say about appeals. The second part of the question was?
It sounds like it's pretty similar, but it would be talking about overcoming a criminal history.
Yeah. So criminal histories, the really nice thing, all of the laws, the rental laws in Minneapolis have changed as of June 1st. And so a lot of criminal history that is older than 3 years can't be looked at or considered in renting. So that's really nice. I think homicide maybe is 10 years, but most other things are 3 years. So just remembering that about Minneapolis, but that's also going to make the housing competition in Minneapolis a little bit more difficult. When things on their record are over 10 years, you can try to get them expunged. So we do a lot of that with our clients. Getting evictions expunged if we can, so that those aren't showing up. So just looking at that. And then also just, you know, talking about this is what your criminal history is. So this is the kind of housing that you'll qualify for. And, you know, and we talk about you've made some poor choices in your life, but you've turned it around. And so that's what we're going to focus on, but we're also not going to apply to places that are hands down not going to accept you.
Thank you. We have just a handful of others, and if I could keep the panel here for just a couple minutes past the hour, and we'll wrap this up, and then thank you so much for all of your time. Corrine, this one is for you, but it also is a larger one, I think, for Mary to think about. So this panelist says, or this attendee says, Corrine, I feel for you. 400 reports in 1 year, and only you, and then one part-timer. So how do you manage the stress? So we can leave that as a rhetorical question. But even for Ramsey County, I think they say 8 staff. I forget exactly what you said, Sherry, that you have on staff. But anyway, this boggles the mind. Here's the question. How does the state decide how many staff to have? And I think it gets at the larger issue that I wanted maybe you all to touch on. Like, are we funding adult protection adequately?
I mean, Mary can speak to this, but I don't think it is the state that determines. I think it's the counties that determine how many staff are here. And I mean, my staff would say that they don't think that we have enough staff. I think the challenge, you know, we aren't money makers. We don't bill for services. And so, you know, some of that comes into play, I think, just from the individual counties as to, you know, what kind of money is available. And I think that is a challenge for sure. And I think staff are sometimes very weary because, at least in our county, when we're doing both intake and investigation, which sounds like you are also, Corrine, trying to flip back and forth between the clients that you currently are trying to serve, and then there's new ones coming in. I mean, I joke sometimes, but it feels like Lucille Ball on the, you know, the chocolate conveyor belt, just trying to stick people in place and keep them till you can get to everybody. But it's definitely a challenge.
So in Minnesota, where we have a county administered social service system and we have an adult protection statute that was developed without funding for that county social service system, it's just exacerbating a long period of time for how our system operates. In 2013 was the first year that the state allocated funds directly or determined funds directly for adult protective services. That's allocated based on the reports open. And that funding was increased again last year by the legislature. But right now we also have a data system that doesn't give us really solid information about what counties are expending. And also the system is only as good as the information that's input into the system to determine how much counties are spending. So the state right now is giving, I think it was on I had it on one of the slides, $4.5 million directed specifically for adult protection programs. There's also state and federal funding through the social service block grant that's allocated out to counties, and that's like $85 million. And counties are deciding how to spend that based on a spending plan that they developed several years ago. So there's $85 million that could potentially, some of that be allocated to adult protection. There's $4.5 million to adult protection. Looking at the report back for what is being spent is under $9 million by counties for adult protection. So it's also an equity issue, because it's going to be based on the resources and funding of the county and how they decide to allocate it, which really is related to why we don't have tribal adult protective services either, because it takes a foundation of a government tax base in order to fund this system.
Yeah, many challenges and probably a whole webinar or
at least
conversation about the funding, the adequate funding of all of this work. I have one more, and then we'll leave it there. And again, thank you so much for your participation. I think this is a pretty good one to leave it on because it asks a somewhat challenging question, and that is, you're working with someone who has already been engaged with APS. Lori, I think this happens a lot in your work. But for whatever reason, you know, your judgment is that APS isn't doing enough. Maybe it's that individual worker. Maybe they've told you, sorry, we can't open a case. Maybe it's a reason you don't know. Maybe the person isn't quote unquote vulnerable as per the statute. But Lori, in your program, you would say, oh, they definitely, you know, have some vulnerabilities. So what are some of, you know, just kind of, what's kind of your last kind of tips and tricks for working, for people there every day working with vulnerable adults who may be self-neglecting, and you just don't, you know, what else can they do creatively to try to meet those unmet needs, especially when they've tried APS and that hasn't worked? Any other kind of final thoughts for some practical advice?
Well, for APS, I mean, for me, we get reports all the time, and not every report gets screened in, especially if it's self-neglect. So sometimes there's already a case manager involved. So we would notify that case manager and work with that case manager and let them know what's going on, and put it back onto that case manager to address the self-neglect, because the case manager is already the one that's, you know, approving services. As an adult protection worker, I can't approve somebody's services. I do more referrals and try to, you know, find other resources out there to help people. So there's that. Sometimes it's people who don't meet the statute. You know, we here at Clay County, we take the most protective. So if I've got a case comes in and it's concerning, we don't have enough information to say this person's a vulnerable adult or not, we'll screen that in and go out and meet with that person and assess and see if they are. And if they're not a vulnerable adult, I can't do an investigation. Doesn't mean that I won't offer services or make recommendations to them, like, hey, you know what, you might qualify for SNAP benefits, or, you know, if you got on medical assistance, you could be qualified for these services, or, you know, those types of things. Or there's energy assistance that could help you, you know, to manage some of these things. It doesn't mean, but it stops me from like doing any ongoing investigation or anything. It's just, hey, this is what's out there. I can help you, you know, you can have those resources, but I'm technically not able to be involved because they don't meet the statute. Sometimes, you know, what people in the community want doesn't match up with what I'm able to do either. You know, I have guidelines, and people have the right to make choices, and they have the right to refuse services, especially if they have the capacity. And that really sometimes makes it very hard as an adult protection worker to look on and see, you know, yes, they are doing these things. I see these things, but they're refusing my services, and they have the right to refuse my services, or the way they choose to live doesn't meet with the society and what other people want them to live, and how they want to live. And it's such a fine line that I can't, as an adult protection worker, I can't make everybody happy. And sometimes it's my client isn't society, my client isn't the other workers, my client is the vulnerable adult. And people need to understand that, who my client is. And I have to do what's best for my client, and what my client wants, and what my client has the capacity to make those decisions. And if not, I try to do what's best for my client. So, but that's a big part of it, is sometimes we just don't line up with society and what society wants for people.
I think that's a great place to leave it, Corrine. And I think it helps summarize one of the more challenging aspects of these particular cases. I want to thank again all of you for joining us, and very much in gratitude for your participation and working with us through. We had originally set this all up way before COVID, and so you've been troopers, Lori, Sherry, Corrine, Mary, all of your colleagues as well. So thank you so much. Thank you for all of the attendees who came today. We had over 350 joining us for the bulk of today's presentation. As I mentioned, there's a lot of resources that we'll push out to you, including links to our website, where we have a lot of resources to kind of help you dig in further to a lot of these issues, contact information for our panelists, and some information about some upcoming events as well. So from our office and from all the panelists, on behalf of them, we hope you stay safe and stay healthy, and we hope to see you in a future webinar. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.